Welcome everyone to our Packers News pregame live show. Alongside Pete Dougherty, I'm Olivia Reiner. The Packers are 90 minutes away from their game against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We'll bring you the latest on some injury updates, the inactives list, plus we'll take a deep dive at the Tampa Bay Bucs defense in just a moment. However, as always, before we begin, we want to hear from you. If you're over on Facebook, Periscope, or YouTube, leave us a question down in the chat, and Pete and I will get to some of those toward the end of our show today. Packers fans, the injury gods did not hear your prayers loud enough for cornerback Kevin King last night, because after missing nearly a week of practice due to a quad injury, King is out today against the Bucs. This is a big loss for the Packers. Defensive coordinator Mike Pettine needed every inch of 6'3" Kevin King's frame to cover one of the tallest receivers in the league, 6'5" Mike Evans. Likely to start in King's place today is cornerback Josh Jackson. Jackson isn't exactly coming off of his best game of the season. Against the Falcons, he allowed catches on all three of his targets, plus he averaged about 12 yards per catch. King, on the other hand, averaged only about 7. The difference between 12 yards and 7 yards, well, that's a first down. How can defensive coordinator Mike Pettine make life a little bit easier for Jackson?
You know, maybe play more zone. He's more of a zone guy than Jackson's more of a zone cover guy than King is, or use him to jam more because Jackson does have some strength, some size and strength, so to jam the receivers up the line. But no matter how you slice it, it's a pretty big drop off from from Alexander and King being your top two guys to Alexander and Jackson. So life gets tougher for Mike Pettine and the Packers defense today. That's for sure.
It's not all doom and gloom on the injury front. For the first time in several weeks, wide receiver Davante Adams is active today after dealing with a hamstring injury. Listen, who needs Davante Adams, though? This Packers offense has been performing so well over the last couple of weeks without him. They've maintained a 38 points per game average, which is the highest in the league. Despite all of that, quarterback Aaron Rodgers has said, hey, if Davante Adams is ready to go, if he's healthy, we need Davante Adams. Pete, what can Davante Adams do to make this very good offense even better?
Well, the one thing he'll do, just his presence, he's the guy that defenses have to account for. Without him, there's no receiver that the defense has to account for, so there's nobody they have to double or look to double most of the time. So if nothing else, he'll draw a lot of the defense's attention. And then the Bucs have a really good run defense, top ranked in the league. So this might be a game where the Packers have to throw it a little more than they have for most of this season, for all of this season so far. And so that'd be full strength, that receiver, at least to have their best receiver. That's a huge help because it's a guy who gets open a lot and a guy who Aaron Rodgers has, complete, absolute trust in.
Let's take a look at that Bucs defense. Packers fans, if you're hoping and dreaming that running back Aaron Jones is going to pop off for some big runs today, you might not want to get your hopes up. The Bucs defense has held 11 consecutive opponents to under 100 rushing yards, and 3 of those opponents to under 50. However, let's give Aaron Jones some credit too. Jones leads the NFL in rushing touchdowns since 2019 with 20 total. Pete, how likely is it that Jones breaks the Bucs streak of success and has a couple big ones today?
Yeah, pretty tough. But the Packers do catch a break. Vita Vea, the Bucs first round pick a couple of years ago, really good interior defensive lineman. He's done for the season with an injury. I think it happened last week, and that's a big loss. They still have a lot of good run stoppers, starting with Ndamukong Suh. He's not the pass rusher he was, when he was playing with the Lions, but he's still a very good run defender. So, and Devin White's a really good young inside middle linebacker, really fast, explosive, dynamic. So it'll be tough going to get 100 yards. They don't need 100 yards to have a good game rushing. It's always more the threat of the run and the play action off of that. So if they just run the ball pretty decently on early downs, especially on first down, when they do run it, if they're picking up really even 4 yards a carry on first down, that's a really good first down play. So that'll tell the tale, I think, more than the overall actual overall aggregate rushing yards will. It's how they run the ball on first and second down to set up second and third downs.
This season, head coach Matt LaFleur has liked to use a lot of pre-snap motion to try and throw the opposing defense off. The guy that usually does that is running back Tyler Ervin. Today, Pete, he's inactive. Who is LaFleur likely to call on to be that pre-snap motion person?
Yeah, he's going to have to use several guys. They would use Lazard a little bit in that too, actually. They used him on end arounds anyway till he got hurt. One thing I was kind of kicking around just the last couple of days was I wonder if they'll, I don't remember seeing it during camp, but I wonder if they put Aaron Jones there because basically it's not really a slot receiver. It's almost like a wingback position. And Jones is a really good receiver. He's actually a better receiver than Ervin is. And so he can do receiver stuff if they line up Jones there. But you also have the threat of, running the jet sweeps. So, that's a huge part of it. Plus the bubble screens that they throw to Ervin. They like to do one or two of those a game where they just basically just turn and throw it to him and have the receivers block for him out on the edge. So, I mean, I have no idea if they're going to do this, but I'm kind of curious to see if they stick Aaron Jones out there for a few snaps, and then they can have either Williams or they could even finally follow through on their threats to get A.J. Dillon in there, and they can play Dillon and Jones together too. I have no reason to think it's coming other than I just wonder because I think he could probably do that better than anybody else that they have on the roster. They're talking about Aaron Jones there.
Let's take a look at the Bucs defensive front and their pass rush as well. This season, the offensive line has been pretty much immaculate at giving Aaron Rodgers as much time as he needs to get the ball out. Rodgers has only taken 3 sacks all season. However, the Bucs are 5th in the league in sack percentage right now. Even safeties Antoine Winfield and Jordan Whitehead have 2 sacks apiece. Pete, it's iron versus iron. Who comes out on top?
Yeah, great question. I'm thinking there that the Packers do between the cadence again. The crowd. I can't remember. I think they're allowing fans in. I'm pretty sure, but I'm sure it's a number where it's not gonna make the Packers go to a silent count. So they've got Rodgers' cadence to slow down the rush, and they've got the threat of the run, which is legit with the Packers this year to slow down the rush. And Rodgers has been getting the ball out really fast this season, much faster than the last couple of years. So I think you throw all that together, and then the line is protected. Well, you throw that all together. I think that'll be something the Packers will be able to hold off, and Rodgers will just get the ball out. He may have to take a few more hits than he wants to take today, but I think my guess is the Packers will handle that better than they would have a year or two ago. And so they can. The Bucs have a good defense, but I think the Packers can neutralize that rush to some degree.
Let's kick it over to Facebook, Periscope, and YouTube for some of your questions. We love seeing all of you all over the world. Thank you so much for joining us today. Let's start with Andy. Andy asks, can wide receiver Equanimeous St. Brown overtake wide receiver Marquez Valdes-Scantling? Valdes-Scantling just doesn't get the targets. Today, wide receiver Equanimeous St. Brown will be active for the first time in over a season after he spent most of the beginning of this season on injured reserve with a knee injury. How do the Packers plan on utilizing St. Brown?
I gotta guess that they'll ease him into it. He's not a guy who's ever played all that much because he's been hurt so much. Yes, he could pass up Valdes-Scantling. I can't imagine. I mean, I just don't think there's much chance of that happening today. But as the season goes on, if you go back to their rookie year, early in that rookie year, Valdes-Scantling was ahead of St. Brown. But by the end of that season, St. Brown was getting the more snaps and more targets than Valdes-Scantling. And then St. Brown missed all of last season. So it's possible he could pass him up. He's getting back early enough in the season where, he's got a lot of time to get his game legs under him. But I would think something like that wouldn't happen for, till much later in the season. I would think that they'd ease St. Brown back. He just hasn't played all that much football, relatively speaking, because he did miss that all last year and then the first 4 games this year. So generally, not always, but generally, they ease these kind of guys coming back from injury. They ease them back into the lineup and playing for a few snaps in that first game back.
Thanks, Andy, for your question. Speaking of offensive weapons, let's take a question here from Benjamin. Benjamin asks, who's most likely to be the star that wins the game for the Packers this week, since it changes weekly? It does seem to change weekly. Last week, the last time the Packers played week 4 against the Atlanta Falcons, it was tight end Robert Tonyan that stepped up for the Packers with 3 touchdowns. The week before, wide receiver Allen Lazard. The week before that, running back Aaron Jones. The week before that, it was wide receiver Devontae Adams. Every single week, there's a different offensive playmaker for this Packers team. Pete, who's it going to be today?
Yeah, and Benjamin's guess is as good as anybody's, right? It could be anybody. Tonyan's probably not the worst guess, although the Bucs will be very much aware of him after the way he's played the last couple games. Adams is a good candidate, but you really don't know because it is somebody different every week, and maybe it'll be Jamal Williams for all we know, depending on how they use Jones today. So it could be any of these guys, and if you don't have. Well, they do have their star back now in Adams, but in the past, I just think back to last year when against the Chargers, that was Adams' first game back, and it looked like Rodgers was forcing the ball in the offense after playing really well without Adams, just tanked that day. And you get the feeling that Rodgers is so much more comfortable in this offense and understanding where to go with the ball, that won't be an issue and that he won't overdo trying to feed the ball to Adams. They want to get the ball to Adams, but he won't. I don't think Rodgers will be as inclined to force it to him at the expense of other guys being open like he did last year against the Chargers.
We would be remiss if we didn't bring up another star for the Packers that is making his triumphant return to the lineup today. As Andrew points out, with defensive lineman Kenny Clark back, what does the starting defensive front look like? Who is going to be on that defensive line? So yes, Clark is back for the first time since week 1 against the Minnesota Vikings as he's been dealing with a groin injury. With Clark back, who does the starting defensive line look like?
Well, if you go with their nickel being their starting line, which basically it is, then it's Clark and Dean Lowry, and as we know, as you and I were talking when the Bucs inactives came out, no Leonard Fournette, who is kind of the Bucs hammer at running back. So getting Clark back is big, and he says he was ready to go 2 weeks ago. Packers held him out, I'm sure, in part because they had the bye coming up, so they just thought it'd get him totally healthy. And hopefully the groin injury won't be an issue the rest of the season. So he should be full bear, ready to go. And that is a big pickup for their defense, both in the pass rush, but especially for their run defense. Clark is one of their 3 or 4 best defensive players.
Thank you, Andrew, for your question. Let's take our next question here from Todd. Todd asks, is outside linebacker Rashawn Gary ready to play today? Every pass rusher helps in this heat. 88 degrees in Tampa. I think it's about half of that in Green Bay right now. Not a beautifully warm day. It's nice and sunny here in Green Bay. Pete, that being said, Rashawn Gary and outside linebacker Zadarius Smith were both limited in practice throughout the week with an ankle injury. They were both listed as questionable heading into today's game. However, they are both active. How is Mike Pettin going to use all of his pass rushers today?
He'll have to, I bet they rotate quite a bit, more than usual, for that reason you cite. Now, I remember seeing the forecast early in the week was 80, and 88, that's a big difference. And even 80, if you've been living in the summer, 78, 79, 80 degrees, it's not that warm. But I remember the Packers playing down in, I think it was in Miami several years ago. TJ Lang was still with them. And it was in later October, and it was like a 78, 79 degree day. And I remember going in the locker room afterwards, and, a lot of the guys were gone, and Lang was sitting at his locker. He had taken off his shoulder pads, but he still had his, uniform pants on. And he just was sitting there. I went up to him. I said, "You okay?" And he goes, "I am just exhausted." And it was because of the heat, because of the difference of, Green Bay for the last 5 or 6 weeks, or, probably 6 weeks, had been really mild to even a little on the cool side. And so that 78 degrees felt like 100 to him. So the heat, especially if it's 88, it'll be a factor for the Packers today. And that'll be an edge for the Bucs. And I think getting back to Pettine, he's going to have to play all three of those outside rushers, Preston Smith being the other one. I bet they rotate those guys more than usual to keep them fresh for the fourth quarter.
LaFleur has emphasized all week, water, hydration. Make sure these guys are getting their electrolytes before heading into this game, and especially during the game as well. Thank you, Todd, for your question. Matthew wants to continue this conversation about the outside linebackers. Matthew asks, will Packers fans see outside linebacker Preston Smith pressure Tom Brady more so than dropping him back into coverage? As we've discussed on our show this week, defensive coordinator Mike Pettine is fond of dropping Preston Smith back into coverage. It was a role that former outside linebacker Kyler Fackrell was privy to before he departed for the New York Giants. How is Pettine going to use Smith primarily today?
Yeah, you never know game-to-game game plans and what they see and what they want to do, or what adjustments they feel like they have to make in-game. Brady gets the ball out fast, but he's in a new offense. So this is, his reads might be just a tick slower sometimes than they would have been if he were still with the Patriots. And Preston Smith last year was, a really good rusher. He hasn't been quite the same guy this year, but I would think the Packers will be looking to get him. I mean, they brought him in to rush the passer, so you don't want to overdo the coverage stuff. I would think they'd want to turn him loose and get him in Brady's face, and he's got that great height and length for, getting his hands up and being a guy you got to throw over or around. So I would think this would be a game to really turn him loose. And the Packers, the pass rush is so big in this league, and they really could use Preston Smith to begin playing more like the guy that they had last year opposite Darius Smith.
Thank you, Matthew, for your question. I've got a fantasy question for you, Pete. Everyone is relying on you. The success of many fantasy teams is in your hands right now, so think carefully. Josh asks, is tight end Robert Tonyan going to be a big part of the offense going forward? Yes, this is a fantasy question. Like I mentioned earlier in our show, Robert Tonyan had 3 touchdowns against the Atlanta Falcons, more touchdowns than he's ever had in his previous 2 seasons. 2018, just 1 touchdown. 2019, just 1 touchdown. In one game, he more than 100% of the total touchdowns that he's had in his career leading up to 2020. Pete, what are the Packers' plans for Robert Tonyan going forward?
Yeah, it's, of course, it's a game-to-game thing with many of these skill guys. But Tonyan has separated himself from the other tight ends on the roster. And he does seem to have made that jump. I was talking with an assistant coach, a guy who had he coached on offense for a long time in this league, and he just retired this offseason. I asked him to look at the Packers' last 2 games just to get his feelings about why they've made this jump on the offense. And we talked about a lot of things, but one of the things that he said fairly early on was, that 85 he looks pretty good. And I think it's, probably fairly safe to say that Tonyan's going to be a pretty big part of the offense for the rest of the season. He seems to have a good chemistry with Rodgers, and he seems to have a much better feel for playing the position than he did a couple of years ago. So, I mean, if you're betting on who's going to have a big game, he's always a fairly safe bet to have at least a decent day statistically.
Thank you so much, Josh, for your question. That is going to do it for us this afternoon, everyone. We'll be back. Don't worry. Ryan and I will have you covered after the game to wrap it up and give you our thoughts. Also live after the game is Leroy Butler and Tom Silverstein. So right before our show, you can watch them around 7:30 over on PackersNews.com and on the Packers News YouTube page, the USA Today Network Wisconsin YouTube page, and you can check them out right before Ryan and I. For Pete, I'm Olivia. We'll see you next time.